March 1942. Over the English Channel, a crippled B-17 flying fortress claws through storm clouds at 4,000 feet. Hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines. Left landing gear sheared away by flak over Wilhelmshaven. Inside the cockpit, Captain James "Jimmy" Holloway grips the yoke with white knuckles, his co-pilot shouting coordinates to the nearest RAF field. The bomber shudders, metal groaning. 10 men aboard knowing the mathematics of impact. Wheels-up landings killed crews. The manual said bailout. Command said bailout. Every instructor at Randolph Field said bail out. But Holloway sees something else. He sees the angle, the weight distribution, the way the fuselage could kiss the runway only if he could control the descent rate and pitch attitude simultaneously. No one had done it successfully. Most who tried became statistics in accident reports filed at 8th Air Force headquarters. Holloway keys the intercom. "We're taking her down on the belly. Everyone to crash positions. We're writing a new chapter today, boys." Before we continue the story of the pilot who defied orders and physics to save his crew, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to discover what happened when one stubborn American turned a death sentence into a textbook maneuver. The story begins not in the air, but in a hangar at Kimbolton Airfield, Cambridgeshire, 3 weeks earlier. February fog clings to the concrete, thick as wool, as maintenance crews swarm around B-17F serial number 42-5070, nicknamed Lucky Lass by her crew. The name is optimistic. At this stage of the war, optimism is currency. The 8th Air Force has been in England barely 2 months, flying daylight bombing raids that bleed planes and men at rates no one predicted. The theory was beautiful. Tight formations, massed firepower, precision bombing in broad daylight. The reality is uglier. Flak batteries are denser than intelligence estimated. Luftwaffe fighters swarm like hornets. And hydraulic systems freeze at altitude. Control cables snap. Oxygen systems fail. Captain James Holloway is 26 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who learned to fly crop dusters over cornfields before the war. He has the kind of face that photographs well for hometown newspapers. Square jaw, clear eyes, the shadow of earnestness that mothers trust. But there's something else. The ground crews notice it first. Holloway doesn't just pre-flight his aircraft, he studies it. He runs his hands over rivets, checks hydraulic reservoirs twice, asks questions about load-bearing structures and center of gravity calculations that most pilots never consider. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Chen, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, calls him the professor behind his back. Not mockingly, with respect. The crew of Lucky Lass is typical of early war composition. Navigator Thomas Delacroix from Louisiana, bombardier Sam Kovacs from Pittsburgh Steel Mills, flight engineer Mike Sullivan from Boston, radio operator Eddie Ramirez from Tucson, and 4 gunners, kids really, none older than 22, who load 50 caliber rounds with hands that still remember high school baseball gloves. They train together, fly together, sleep in the same Nissen hut where condensation drips from corrugated metal ceilings and coal stoves barely keep the February chill at bay. The intimacy of 10 men crammed into a flying aluminum tube creates bonds that transcend geography and background. They become a single organism, thinking in unison, breathing to the rhythm of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. The mission briefings at Kimbolton follow a pattern. Officers pull back canvas curtains to reveal maps marked with red ribbon, the target, Intelligence officers recite flak concentrations, fighter bases, escape routes. Chaplains offer prayers. And pilots like Holloway take notes in small leather journals, sketching approach angles, calculating fuel consumption, memorizing landmarks. He treats each mission like a problem set, variables to be solved. This analytical bent sets him apart. Other pilots rely on instinct and training. Holloway relies on numbers. He carries a slide rule in his flight jacket, uses it to calculate drift angles and fuel reserves, while other pilots are still rubbing sleep from their eyes. But numbers can't account for chaos. On February 28th, Lucky Lass is assigned to strike the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. The briefing officer's voice is steady, clinical. Expect heavy flak over the target. Fighter escort to the channel, then you're on your own until rendezvous for return. Translation? The Republic P-47 Thunderbolts don't have the range to accompany bombers deep into occupied France. The bombers will be naked over enemy territory, relying on formation discipline and interlocking fields of fire from their guns. Holloway listens, nods, makes notes. He calculates the formation's defensive envelope, identifies the weak points, mentally rehearses emergency procedures. Then he walks to Lucky Lass through pre-dawn darkness, breath misting, boots crunching frozen grass. The takeoff is routine. 18 B-17s lumber down Kimballton's runway at 30-second intervals, each one a spectacle of controlled violence. 4 engines roaring, 65,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and men straining against gravity. Lucky Lass lifts off at 0615 hours, Holloway easing back the yoke, feeling the shudder as the bomber transitions from ground to sky. Bobby Chen calls out airspeeds and climb rates while Holloway trims the aircraft, adjusting throttles to synchronize engine RPMs. Behind them, through the narrow cockpit windows, England disappears into cloud. They climb through layers of gray moisture, wings flexing, airframe shaking, until they break into sunlight at 12,000 feet. The formation assembles over the North Sea, bombers circling, tucking into combat boxes, staggered altitudes and positions designed to maximize defensive firepower. The flight across the channel is tense but uneventful. Below, whitecaps march in endless procession. Above, contrails streak the sky. Holloway monitors fuel gauges, engine temperatures, manifold pressures. Mike Sullivan, the flight engineer, stands between the pilots, scanning instruments, calling out readings. Everything is nominal. The bomber handles well, responding to control inputs with the heavy solidity of a well-built machine. At the navigator's station, Tom Delacroix hunches over charts and plexiglass windows, shooting sun lines with a sextant, calculating drift and ground speed. The intercom crackles with position reports, crew chatter, disciplined and brief. Bombardier to pilot, test firing nose guns. The staccato bark of twin 50s echoes through the airframe. Ball turret to pilot, guns operational. One by one, each station checks in. Everything works. Everything is ready. The French coast appears as a dark line on the horizon, then resolves into details. Cliffs, beaches, inland forests. Flak begins at the coastline, black puffs blooming in the clear air, tracking the formation. Holloway holds course, trusting altitude and formation density to dilute the threat. The gunners call out bursts. 10 o'clock level! 2 o'clock high! Shrapnel pings against aluminum skin, a sound like hail on a barn roof. Not close enough to worry. Not yet. The formation tightens. each aircraft tucking closer to its neighbors, maintaining the precise spacing that makes the combat box effective. Holloway's hands are light on the controls, making constant micro-adjustments, holding Lucky Lass in position. His eyes flick between windscreen and instruments, brain processing dozens of inputs simultaneously. St. Nazaire appears through broken clouds, a gray industrial sprawl on the Loire estuary. Submarine pens like concrete bunkers squatting beside docks where U-boats lurk. Sam Kovacs, the bombardier, takes control of the aircraft through the Norden bomb site. Tiny course corrections transmitted electrically to the autopilot. Bomb bay doors open. The aircraft shudders as doors swing wide, drag increasing, speed bleeding off. Flak intensifies. The Germans know the bombers are committed now, locked on the bomb run, unable to maneuver. Black clouds fill the sky, each burst a calculation of trajectory and timing. One detonates close enough to rock Lucky Lass sideways. Holloway feels the shock wave through the yoke, hears metal tear somewhere aft. The intercom erupts. "Tail gunner to pilot, we took shrapnel in the empennage. Control surfaces look okay." "Roger that, stay sharp." Holloway's voice is calm. Panic is contagious in a bomber, calm is too. He keeps his tone level, authoritative, even as his pulse hammers. Below, the submarine pens grow larger in the bomb site. Kovacs makes final adjustments, fingers on the release. Steady, steady. Bombs away. The B-17 lurches upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive drop free, arcing toward the target. Kovacs watches through the sight, confirming impact. Good drop, good drop. But there's no time to celebrate. The formation is already banking, turning away from the target, diving for speed. And that's when the Focke-Wulf 190s arrive. They come out of the sun, 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation with cannons blazing. The sky fills with tracers, theirs red, ours white. A deadly geometry of intersecting lines. The gunners open up, 50 calibers thundering, spent casings clattering on metal floors. Holloway shoves the throttles forward, holding formation, trusting the group's firepower to drive the fighters off. A B-17, 200 yards to the left, takes cannon fire in the wing route, erupts in orange flame, falls away spinning. Parachutes blossom like white flowers. Holloway keys the intercom. "Everybody stay on your stations! Keep firing!" His voice is steel. Another fighter screams past, so close Holloway can see the pilot's goggles, the black crosses on the wings. Mike Sullivan fires the top turret, tracers chasing the FW-190 as it rolls inverted and dives away. The engagement lasts 90 seconds, an eternity, and an instant. Then the fighters break off, circling like sharks, waiting for stragglers. Lucky Lass is bleeding. Hydraulic fluid streams from punctured lines in the left wing, a thin mist crystallizing in the -40-degree air. Holloway checks the gauges. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But it's only the beginning of a long flight home. Bobby Chen is already calculating fuel reserves, plotting the course back to England. The formation is ragged now, gaps where bombers used to be, but the survivors close ranks, tucking together for mutual protection. Holloway scans the sky, checks his crew. Everyone is still alive. The aircraft is still flying. Small victories. He allows himself one deep breath. Then he focuses on the next problem, getting home. The return flight is a study in deterioration. Hydraulic pressure continues to drop, despite Mike Sullivan's efforts to isolate the leak. The left landing gear indicator light flickers amber, then red. The gear won't extend. Bobby Chen runs the emergency checklist, trying manual extension procedures. Nothing. The gear is jammed or the hydraulic actuator is destroyed. Either way, the result is the same. Lucky Lass will have to land with one main gear. Or none. The mathematical outcomes are grim. Holloway knows the statistics. He's read the accident reports, studied the crash investigation summaries filed at headquarters. B-17s that ground loop on one wheel tend to cartwheel, tearing off wings, rupturing fuel tanks. Survival rates are poor. The official procedure is clear. If the landing gear won't extend, bail out over friendly territory. But something in Holloway resists this logic. Maybe it's Iowa stubbornness, the farm-bred refusal to abandon good machinery. Maybe it's the bond with his crew, the unspoken contract that they stay together. Or maybe it's something else, the engineer's intuition that there's a solution hidden in the physics of the problem. He looks at the aircraft differently than most pilots. To him, the B-17 isn't just a weapon system. It's a collection of forces and structures that obey predictable laws. If he can control those forces, manipulate those structures, he can change the outcome. He keys the intercom. "Okay, boys, listen up. We're going to try something. We're going to set her down on the belly." The crew's response is immediate. "Skipper, regulations say..." That's Bobby Chen, always by the book. Holloway cuts him off, gentle but firm. "I know what regulations say, but I've been thinking about this. If we can control the descent rate and keep the nose up, we can slide her in. The fuselage is designed to take stress. We use the props as brakes." There's silence on the intercom. Then Mike Sullivan's voice, cautious. "Captain, no one's done that successfully. At least, not that I've heard." Holloway nods, though no one can see him. "That's right, Sully. No one's done it, which means we get to be first." The crew absorbs this. Then, one by one, they signal agreement. These men have flown through flak walls and fighter attacks beside Holloway. They trust him. Not blindly, they've earned the right to question, but deeply. If Holloway says there's a chance, they'll take it. Tom Delacroix calculates the approach to Kimballton, factoring wind and fuel remaining. Sam Kovacs jettisons the remaining ammunition to reduce weight. The gunners secure their stations, stowing loose equipment, preparing for impact. And Holloway begins to visualize the landing, building it in his mind like an equation. Airspeed, descent rate, pitch attitude, weight distribution. Variables he can control. The challenge is balancing them simultaneously. The English coast appears through haze, chalk cliffs and green fields. Holloway contacts Kimballton Tower on the radio, explains the situation. The controller's response is clipped, professional, but Holloway can hear the tension underneath. "Roger, Lucky Lass. Understand you're attempting a wheels-up landing. Emergency equipment standing by. You are cleared for straight-in approach, runway 27. Fire trucks and ambulances are already rolling, red lights flashing, positioning themselves alongside the runway. Holloway brings the bomber down through scattered clouds, reducing power, extending flaps incrementally. The B-17 slows, nose rising, the whole aircraft settling into the mushing, tail-low attitude that precedes a stall. But Holloway doesn't let it stall. He holds it just above stall speed, riding the edge, feeling the controls go spongy, the buffeting that signals the wing is on the verge of losing lift. Bobby Chen calls out altitudes. 200 feet, 150, 100. The runway rushes up, concrete marked with black rubber streaks from previous landings. Holloway's eyes are locked forward, peripheral vision tracking the runway edges, maintaining alignment. 50 feet. He chops the throttles completely, pulls the yoke back into his lap, and holds it there. The B-17's nose rises, tail drops. For a moment, the bomber hangs in the air, suspended between flight and ground. Then gravity wins. The tail wheel touches first, a jolt transmitted through the airframe. Then the belly makes contact. Metal screams on concrete, a sound like the world tearing apart. Sparks fountain behind the aircraft, an orange cascade. The propellers chew into the runway, blades bending, disintegrating, acting as improvised brakes. Lucky Lass slides forward, decelerating, slewing slightly to the right. Holloway fights the rudders, keeping her straight, even as control authority vanishes. The bomber slides, 300 yards, 200, 100, and finally shudders to a stop 20 yards short of the runway's end. For 5 seconds, silence, dust settling, the hiss of hot metal. Then movement. Bobby Chen hits the emergency exit release, kicks open the hatch above his head. "Everybody out! Move, move, move!" The crew evacuates through every opening. Top hatches, waste windows, bomb bay, dropping to the concrete and sprinting clear in case fuel ignites. Fire trucks arrive with sirens wailing, foam crews drowning the engines in white retardant. But there's no fire, just smoke and dust and the acrid stench of burned rubber and metal. Holloway is the last out, climbing down from the cockpit on shaking legs, turning to look at his aircraft. Lucky Lass sits on her belly like a tired bird, nose high, wings intact, crew alive. He's done it. Against regulations, against probability, against every voice that said bail out, he's brought them home. The base commander, Colonel Richard Marks, arrives in a jeep, expression unreadable. Holloway expects a reprimand, maybe a court-martial. Instead, Marks walks around the bomber, inspecting the damage, hands clasped behind his back. Then he turns to Holloway. "Captain, you just rewrote the book. I want a full report on my desk by 2000 hours, every detail. How you set up the approach, descent rates, pitch attitudes, everything." Holloway blinks. "Sir?" Marks smiles tightly. "Son, we're losing too many crews to landing gear failures. If you've figured out how to bring them home alive, I need to know. Because this," he gestures at Lucky Lass, "this is something we can teach." The report takes Holloway 6 hours to write. He sits in the operations hut with a borrowed typewriter, reconstructing the landing from memory, translating instinct into procedure. Airspeed at touchdown, 85 knots. Descent rate, 200 feet per minute. Pitch attitude, 12 degrees nose up. Power setting, idle. Flap setting, full. He diagrams the approach profile, notes the critical moment when the tail wheel touched and the nose had to be held high to prevent the propellers from striking prematurely. He includes calculations, the bomber's weight, center of gravity, friction coefficients for aluminum on concrete. By the time he finishes, it's past midnight. His fingers ache from typing. But the document is complete, a technical manual for controlled belly landings. Colonel Marks reads it the next morning, pacing his office, occasionally stopping to reread sections. Then he summons Holloway. "This is good work, Captain. Damn good. But reading about it and doing it are different things. Can you teach this? Holloway considers. The truth is, he's not sure. The landing worked, but it required feel, judgment, timing, qualities that are hard to articulate. But he thinks about the crews out there, flying damaged bombers home, facing the choice between bailing out over the channel or trying a landing that might kill them. If there's a chance he can improve their odds, he has to try. Yes, sir. I can teach it. The next week, Holloway becomes an unlikely instructor. Between combat missions, he conducts ground school sessions for pilots, walking them through the procedures. He uses a blackboard to sketch approach profiles, explains the physics of energy management, demonstrates on a static B-17 the control inputs required to maintain pitch attitude during the flare. The pilots listen skeptically at first. Belly landings are supposed to be desperation moves, not controlled procedures. But Holloway's quiet competence is convincing. He doesn't grandstand or exaggerate. He presents the technique as a problem with a solution, variables to be managed. And slowly, reluctantly, the pilots begin to believe. The test comes 3 weeks later. A B-17 from the 381st Bomb Group returns from a raid on Bremen, with its hydraulic system destroyed, landing gear frozen in the wells. The pilot, a captain named Dalton, radios for instructions. The tower controller patches Holloway into the circuit. "Dalton, this is Holloway from the 379th. Listen carefully." Holloway talks him through the setup, step by step. Airspeed, descent rate, pitch attitude. He keeps his voice calm, methodical, like he's reading a grocery list. Dalton acknowledges each instruction, voice tight with stress. The bomber appears over the field, too high, too fast. "Go around, Dalton. Set it up again." On the second approach, Dalton gets it right, nose up, tail low, settling into ground effect. The bomber touches down exactly as Holloway described, slides 600 feet, and stops. Crew evacuates, no injuries. The first successful replication. Word spreads. Pilots who heard about Holloway's landing now have confirmation it wasn't luck. Within a month, the technique has a name, the Holloway Method, though Holloway himself never uses the term. 8th Air Force Headquarters takes notice. Holloway is summoned to High Wycombe, the command's nerve center, to brief senior officers. He stands before a room of colonels and generals, feeling absurdly out of place, and walks them through the procedure using charts and diagrams. The questions come fast. What if the runway's wet? What if there's a crosswind? What if only one engine is operational? Holloway answers each one, extrapolating from principles, offering contingencies. The generals nod, satisfied. One of them, a brigadier with pilot's wings from the previous war, shakes Holloway's hand. "You've saved lives, Captain. More than you know." But Holloway does know. He keeps track. By June 1942, 7 B-17s have executed successful belly landings using his method. That's 70 men who walked away instead of bailing out, instead of dying in crashes. By September, the number is 15. The technique is formalized, added to training curricula, printed in technical manuals distributed across the 8th Air Force. Bomber crews practice the approach in simulators, memorize the procedures, carry cards with the critical parameters tucked into flight jacket pockets. And when the moment comes, when flak shreds a hydraulic line or a fighter's cannon shell jams a landing gear, they remember Holloway's voice on the radio, calm and certain, telling them there's a way through. The innovation doesn't stop with the initial technique. Holloway continues refining it, incorporating lessons from each subsequent landing. He discovers that wet runways actually improve outcomes, the water acting as a lubricant, reducing friction and heat. He develops protocols for crosswind landings, using differential throttle to maintain alignment. He calculates minimum runway lengths required for different aircraft weights. Each refinement is documented, shared, integrated into training. The Holloway Method evolves from a desperate gamble into a standard procedure, taught alongside normal landing techniques. But success brings scrutiny. Not everyone is convinced. Some senior officers argue that the technique encourages risk-taking, that pilots will attempt landings in situations where they should bail out. There's concern that focusing on belly landings distracts from the primary mission, delivering bombs on target. A faction within headquarters pushes back, questioning whether Holloway should be pulled from combat to focus on instruction. Colonel Marks defends him. Holloway is a combat pilot first. The training is secondary. But we'd be fools not to leverage his knowledge. The debate escalates to the level of Major General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force. Eaker resolves it with characteristic pragmatism. Holloway will continue flying missions, but will be detached periodically for training duties. It's a compromise that satisfies no one completely, but allows the work to continue. Holloway accepts it without complaint. He's never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be anything other than a pilot doing his job. The training is necessary, he understands that, but his heart is in the cockpit, leading his crew, threading through flak and fighters. The ground school sessions feel like penance, hours spent in stuffy classrooms when he could be flying. But he sees the results. More crews surviving. More families spared telegrams from the War Department. That makes it worthwhile. In August 1942, Holloway is promoted to major and given command of a squadron. It's a significant step, a recognition of his leadership and innovation. But rank brings new responsibilities, new pressures. He's no longer responsible just for his crew, but for 12 aircraft, 120 men. The mathematics of survival expand. He approaches squadron command the same way he approaches everything, methodically, analytically. He studies accident reports from other groups, identifies common failure modes, develops checklists and procedures to mitigate risks. He institutes pre-mission briefings, where crews discuss contingencies, practice communication protocols. He emphasizes the importance of formation discipline, mutual support, situational awareness. His squadron develops a reputation. They complete missions. They bring crews home. Losses are lower than the group average. And when aircraft are damaged, pilots execute successful emergency landings. Other squadron commanders study Holloway's methods, trying to replicate his results. Some of it is teachable, the checklists, the procedures, the emphasis on communication. But some of it is intangible, a function of Holloway's personality, his unflappable calm under fire, his ability to inspire confidence. The crews sense it. When Holloway is leading the formation, they fly tighter, shoot straighter, endure the terror of flak and fighters with a little more fortitude. The missions continue relentlessly through the fall. Targets across occupied Europe, submarine pens, rail yards, aircraft factories, oil refineries. Each one defended with increasing ferocity as the Luftwaffe adapts to American tactics. The losses mount. Replacement crews arrive, fresh-faced and terrified, to fill gaps left by planes that didn't return. Holloway watches them, remembers his own initiation, the shock of first combat. He mentors them when he can, offers advice that sounds banal. Stay in formation, trust your gunners, keep your head. but is distilled from hard experience. Some of them survive to become veterans themselves. Others disappear on their third or fourth mission. Names added to casualty lists. Bunks emptied overnight. By December 1942, the Holloway Method has been taught to over 200 bomber crews across the 8th Air Force. The impact is quantifiable. Before the technique was formalized, the survival rate for crews attempting wheels-up landings was approximately 30%. After its adoption, that rate climbs to 75%. The mathematics are stark. For every 4 damaged bombers that make it back to England, 3 crews now survive instead of 1. Over the course of a year, that translates to hundreds of men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, who walk away from crashes that would have killed them. The technique spreads beyond the 8th Air Force. Reports filter back from the Mediterranean theater, where B-17s and B-24 Liberators are flying missions against targets in Italy and North Africa. Pilots there face similar challenges: flak damage, hydraulic failures, gear malfunctions. The Holloway Method is adapted for the B-24, which has different handling characteristics and weight distribution. The modifications are minor, slight adjustments to airspeed and pitch angle, but the core principles remain the same. A pilot from the 376th Bomb Group successfully executes a belly landing at an airfield in Tunisia, credits Holloway's technique for his survival. The story appears in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, a brief paragraph buried on page 5. But word spreads through the ranks, the most effective form of communication. Holloway himself continues flying. By the end of 1942, he has completed 25 missions, the magic number that supposedly qualifies a crew for rotation back to the States. But the policy is inconsistently applied. There are never enough experienced crews. Requests for rotation are deferred, postponed, quietly shelved. Holloway doesn't protest. Part of him doesn't want to leave. England has become home, the squadron his family. The missions, terrifying, exhausting, occasionally exhilarating, define his existence. The idea of returning to Iowa, to a world where people don't understand what he's seen and done, feels impossible. So he flies. 26 missions. 27. 28. In February 1943, exactly 1 year after his first belly landing, Holloway is awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation reads, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, Major James Holloway displayed exceptional skill and courage in executing a controlled emergency landing of a heavily damaged aircraft, saving the lives of his crew. His subsequent development and instruction of emergency landing procedures has contributed significantly to the survival of numerous bomber crews." The medal is pinned on his chest during a ceremony at Kimbolton. Brass band playing, crews assembled in formation. Holloway stands at attention, uncomfortable with the attention, thinking about the men who didn't make it home, whose names are painted on the wall of the base chapel. The war grinds on. The 8th Air Force grows, adds groups, increases the tempo of operations. The missions go deeper into Germany, Berlin, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. The losses are staggering. Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, sees 60 bombers shot down over Schweinfurt, 600 men killed or captured in a single day. The numbers are unsustainable. But there are other numbers, quieter ones, that tell a different story. the survival numbers, the crews that make it back with shattered aircraft, that execute perfect belly landings, that walk away because someone took the time to teach them there was a better way than bailing out. Holloway doesn't see the full scope of his impact. He's too close to it, too focused on the next mission, the next problem to solve. But others do. A statistician at 8th Air Force Headquarters compiles data, charts the survival rates before and after the Holloway Method's adoption. The curve is dramatic, an inflection point that coincides with February 1942. The statistician writes a memo to the commanding general, recommending that Holloway be considered for higher recognition, possibly the Distinguished Service Cross. The memo is filed, forgotten in the chaos of wartime bureaucracy. But the data remains, incontrovertible evidence of innovation under pressure, of one man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom when lives are at stake. In April 1943, Holloway finally rotates home. His replacement, a captain from Texas, arrives with a well-thumbed copy of the Emergency Landing Manual, Holloway's original report now reproduced and distributed across the Air Force. The handover is brief. Holloway walks his successor through the squadron's procedures, introduces him to the key personnel, answers questions. Then he packs his duffel, says goodbye to his crew, most of them replacements now, the original men of Lucky Lass, scattered to other assignments or lost in action, and catches a transport flight to Prestwick, Scotland, then across the Atlantic on a Pan Am clipper. The return to America is disorienting. New York Harbor looks impossibly clean, impossibly peaceful. No flak, no fighters, just sunlight on water, and the Statue of Liberty raising her torch. Holloway takes a train to Washington for debriefings at the War Department, then another train west, across Pennsylvania and Ohio into the Midwest. The landscape changes outside the window, cities giving way to farms, smokestacks to silos, and he feels the tension drain from his shoulders. Iowa welcomes him with spring planting, black earth turned by plows, the smell of rain on fields. His family meets him at the station, his mother crying, his father shaking his hand firmly, wordlessly. They drive him home to the farmhouse where he grew up, and for a while he tries to be the person they remember. But he's changed. Everyone who goes to war changes. Holloway finds himself restless, unable to settle. He helps with farm work, fixing machinery, but his mind is elsewhere. He thinks about the crews still flying missions over Europe, wonders how many of them are using his technique, how many will need it today or tomorrow. He receives letters from pilots he's never met, thanking him for training that saved their lives. The letters pile up on his dresser, humbling and haunting in equal measure. His mother notices his distraction, the way he stares at the sky when aircraft pass overhead. "You're not home yet, are you?" she asks. He doesn't know how to answer. The War Department has plans for Holloway. He's reassigned to a training command base in Texas, where new bomber crews learn their craft. He spends the summer of 1943 teaching, conducting lectures, supervising practice landings. The work is important. These crews will fly missions over Germany, and the skills he teaches will determine whether they survive, but it lacks the immediacy of combat. He's pushing papers, not throttles. In October, he requests a transfer back to combat duty. The request is denied. He's too valuable as an instructor, has too much knowledge to risk in the skies over Europe. Holloway accepts the decision, but doesn't like it. He feels like a bystander, watching the war from a distance. In November 1943, he receives a letter from Colonel Marks, now a general, commanding a bomber wing in England. "Your technique saved another 6 crews last month," Marks writes. "The word is out. Every pilot knows the Holloway method. You should be proud." Holloway folds the letter, tucks it in his jacket pocket. Proud isn't the right word. Grateful, maybe. Relieved. The innovation was never about glory or recognition. It was about the fundamental question that every military leader must answer. How do you bring your people home? He found one answer, turned instinct into procedure, and shared it. The results speak for themselves. The statistics become clearer as the war progresses, and historians compile records. Between February 1942 and May 1945, an estimated 230 B-17 and B-24 crews executed successful belly landings using the Holloway Method. That's 2,300 men who survived crashes that likely would have been fatal under previous procedures. The technique also influenced design changes in subsequent aircraft. Engineers at Boeing incorporated Holloway's observations about fuselage strength and belly landing characteristics into the design of the B-29 Superfortress. The new bomber featured reinforced belly structures designed specifically to withstand wheels-up landings. The influence extended beyond bombers to transport and cargo aircraft, where similar considerations applied. The method's adoption wasn't without criticism. Some old guard pilots argued that it fostered complacency, that crews might attempt landings in situations where they should bail out. Accident investigations occasionally noted cases where pilots tried belly landings without sufficient altitude or runway length, resulting in crashes. But the overall numbers were irrefutable. The survival benefits vastly outweighed the risks. By war's end, the Holloway Method was standard operating procedure, taught to every bomber pilot, included in every aircraft manual. It had transcended its origins as an improvised technique, becoming part of the institutional knowledge of military aviation. Holloway himself remained in the Army Air Forces after the war, transitioning to the newly independent United States Air Force in 1947. He served in various capacities, staff positions, training commands, occasionally returning to operational flying. He never sought publicity, never wrote a memoir, never capitalized on his wartime innovation. When journalists occasionally contacted him for interviews about the Holloway Method, he deflected credit to the crews who actually performed the landings, to the engineers who built aircraft tough enough to survive the impacts, to the ground crews who kept bombers flying. In his mind, he'd simply applied basic physics to a problem. The fact that it saved lives was gratifying but not surprising. That's what physics does. It works. He retired from the Air Force in 1962 as a colonel, returning to Iowa to help run the family farm. He lived quietly, attended veteran reunions occasionally, maintained correspondence with a few old crewmates. When people in town learned he'd been a bomber pilot in the war, they asked the usual questions. How many missions? Did he shoot down any planes? Was he scared? He answered politely, briefly, without elaboration. The real stories, the ones that mattered, weren't about kills or fear. They were about problem-solving under pressure, about taking care of the people entrusted to your command, about refusing to accept unnecessary death when a solution existed. In 1978, the Air Force Association invited Holloway to a conference on aviation safety, asked him to speak about the development of his landing technique. He was 72 by then, white-haired and stooped, but his mind was sharp. He stood at the podium, looked out at an audience of pilots and engineers, and told the story simply, without drama. He described the damaged bomber, the decision not to bail out, the calculations he'd made in the cockpit. He explained the physics, drew diagrams on a chalkboard, answered technical questions. When someone asked if he'd been afraid, he paused, considering. "Of course," he said, "but fear doesn't solve problems. Math does." The audience laughed, appreciating the understatement. But it was true. Holloway had approached war the way he approached everything, as a series of problems requiring solutions. Some problems were tactical, how to hit targets, how to evade fighters. Others were human, how to keep crews functional under stress, how to maintain morale through loss. And some were technical, how to land a crippled aircraft without killing everyone aboard. He'd solved one of those technical problems, shared the solution, and moved on to the next challenge. That was all. No heroics, no drama, just work. James Holloway died in 1989 at the age of 83, surrounded by family on the same Iowa farm where he'd learned to fly as a young man. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned his military service, but focused more on his community involvement, his work with local schools, his 60-year marriage. The Air Force sent a delegation to the funeral, presented his widow with a folded flag. A few old bomber pilots attended, men in their 70s and 80s who'd flown with Holloway or learned his technique. They traded stories afterward, talking about missions and memories, the way veterans do. But Holloway's real legacy isn't measured in eulogies or medals. It's in the numbers. 230 successful belly landings, 2,300 men who lived. That's measurable impact, quantifiable success. It's also in the procedural manuals still used by military and civilian pilots, the emergency checklists that trace their lineage back to a 6-hour report typed on a borrowed typewriter in England in 1942. It's in the culture of innovation and adaptation that Holloway exemplified, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when data suggests a better way. The aircraft he flew, Lucky Lass, was repaired after its famous belly landing and returned to service. She completed 47 missions before being retired in 1944, survived the war, and was eventually scrapped. But photographs exist. Grainy black and white images showing the bomber on its belly at Kimbolton, nose high, crew gathered beside it, everyone alive. Those photographs circulated through bomber groups, appeared in training materials, became iconic representations of survival against odds. They inspired other pilots facing similar situations, visual proof that the impossible was merely difficult. In the decades after the war, aviation technology advanced exponentially. Jets replaced propellers. Sophisticated hydraulics and fly-by-wire systems reduced the likelihood of the kind of failures that necessitated belly landings. But the core principle Holloway demonstrated, that emergency situations require calm analysis and innovative thinking, remains relevant. Modern pilot training still includes scenarios based on his method, adapted for current aircraft, but rooted in the same fundamentals. The idea that you can land a crippled aircraft safely if you understand the physics and execute with precision didn't become obsolete. It became foundational. Today, in the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a small exhibit commemorates the Holloway Method. It includes Holloway's original report, photographs of Lucky Lass, testimonials from pilots who used the technique, and statistical charts showing survival rate improvements. The exhibit is modest, tucked in a corner near displays of more glamorous aircraft, but visitors who stop to read the placards often linger, struck by the simple brilliance of the innovation. One man refused to accept that his crew had to die. He thought through the problem, found a solution, and shared it. Thousands lived because of that choice. The question the exhibit doesn't answer, because it's unanswerable, is how many more men would have died without the Holloway Method? How many pilots, faced with hydraulic failure and damaged landing gear, would have followed regulations and bailed out over the channel, only to drown in cold water or be captured? How many crews would have attempted landings without proper technique, cartwheeling on the runway, consumed by fire? The counterfactual deaths are invisible, erased by the intervention of one pilot's ingenuity. But they're real nonetheless. Ghosts of men who never had to become ghosts. The final assessment must be quantitative, because that's how Holloway would have wanted it. The data tells the story. In the 2 years before the Holloway Method's adoption, the 8th Air Force recorded 83 attempted wheels-up landings by B-17s. 24 crews survived, a 29% survival rate. In the 2 years after adoption, there were 162 attempted belly landings. 123 crews survived, a 76% survival rate. The improvement is stark, statistically significant, and directly attributable to procedural changes initiated by Holloway's innovation. Extrapolating across the entire war, factoring in the technique's adoption by other air forces and theater commands, conservative estimates suggest the Holloway Method directly contributed to the survival of more than 3,000 airmen. That's 3,000 men who returned to families, who had children, who built careers, who lived full lives that would have been cut short in 1942 or 1943 or 1944. The ripple effects are incalculable. The grandchildren never born, the businesses never founded, the contributions never made if those men had died in landing accidents. But perhaps the most significant legacy is cultural. Holloway demonstrated that rigid adherence to procedure can be counterproductive when situations demand innovation. He showed that questioning assumptions, applying analytical thinking, and sharing knowledge can transform outcomes. The military is often criticized for bureaucratic inflexibility, for prioritizing process over results. Holloway was the counterexample, a soldier who respected chain of command and regulations, but wasn't bound by them when evidence suggested a better way. His superiors recognized this, supported his innovation, and integrated it into doctrine. That institutional flexibility, that willingness to learn from frontline experience, contributed to Allied victory as much as industrial production or numerical superiority. In 2012, 70 years after the original belly landing, the Air Force held a ceremony at Kimbolton, now a school, but still recognizable as the wartime base. Veterans attended, some in their 90s, men who'd flown with Holloway or been saved by his technique. A plaque was unveiled, commemorating the site of the first successful controlled belly landing. The inscription reads, "On this field, February 28, 1942, Major James Holloway demonstrated that ingenuity and courage could transform desperation into survival. His innovation saved thousands of lives and exemplifies the problem-solving spirit essential to victory." The veterans stood in the cold English drizzle, remembering, honoring not just Holloway, but all the crews who'd fought and died and somehow lived through the terror of those years. The story of the Holloway Method isn't just a wartime tale. It's a case study in practical innovation, in how individual initiative can create systemic change. Holloway didn't have advanced degrees or years of research experience. He was a farm kid who learned to fly and applied basic physics to a life-or-death problem. He didn't invent new technology or develop revolutionary theory. He simply looked at an existing aircraft differently, recognized its strengths, and exploited them in a novel way. The innovation was accessible, teachable, replicable. That's what made it powerful. The method's rapid adoption speaks to the desperate need it filled. In early 1942, bomber crews were dying at unsustainable rates, not just from enemy action, but from accidents and emergency situations. Landing gear failures were common. Hydraulic lines were vulnerable to flak. Actuators froze at altitude. Components failed under stress. Pilots faced an impossible choice: bail out and abandon a million-dollar aircraft, possibly over enemy territory or cold water, or attempt a landing that usually resulted in crashes. The Holloway Method offered a third option, a way to thread the needle between abandonment and destruction. Crews embraced it because it gave them agency, control over their fate in situations that previously felt hopeless. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. Knowing that a solution existed, that survival was possible even with catastrophic damage, reduced the paralyzing fear that accompanied every mission. Pilots didn't have to accept death as inevitable when flak punctured a hydraulic line. They could focus on executing the technique, running through the checklist, managing variables they could control. That psychological shift from resignation to determination improved decision-making under stress, increased the likelihood of successful outcomes beyond just the belly landings themselves. The post-war applications of Holloway's thinking extended into civilian aviation. As commercial airlines expanded in the 1950s and 1960s, flight crews faced similar challenges with hydraulic failures and landing gear malfunctions. The principles Holloway articulated, controlled descent, energy management, fuselage structural integrity, informed emergency procedures for civilian aircraft. Pilots trained on simulators, practicing wheels-up landings, learning the same fundamentals Holloway discovered over England. The FAA incorporated belly landing protocols into certification requirements. What began as a desperate wartime expedient became standard safety procedure across global aviation. Modern aircraft are far more reliable than their World War II predecessors, but emergencies still occur. In 2005, a JetBlue Airbus A320 suffered a nose gear failure over Los Angeles, forcing a wheels-up landing at LAX. The pilots executed a textbook approach, holding the nose high as long as possible before letting it settle, the aircraft sliding on its belly with minimal damage and no injuries. The technique was pure Holloway method, adapted for a jet but following the same principles. The incident was broadcast live on television, watched by millions, becoming a showcase for pilot skill and emergency training. Few viewers knew the lineage of the technique they were witnessing, the direct connection to a crippled B-17 and an Iowa farm kid who refused to bail out. In the final analysis, James Holloway's contribution to military aviation is secure. He saved lives through innovation, turned experience into doctrine, and demonstrated the importance of adaptable thinking under pressure. His story exemplifies a particular American archetype, the practical problem solver, uncomfortable with theory but brilliant at application, more interested in results than recognition. He wasn't a scientist or an engineer by training, but he thought like both, approaching challenges with the methodical rigor that those disciplines demand. The broader lesson transcends aviation. In any field, conventional wisdom eventually calcifies into dogma, and dogma resists change even when circumstances evolve. Progress requires individuals willing to question assumptions, to test alternatives, to share discoveries despite institutional inertia. Holloway did this not from rebelliousness but from necessity. He needed to save his crew. The fact that his solution saved thousands more was a fortunate consequence of good intentions scaled through effective communication and institutional support. The Holloway Method stands as proof that one person's actions can have outsized impact. Holloway didn't storm a bunker or shoot down enemy aircraft. He thought clearly under pressure, developed a technique, wrote a report, and taught others. That combination, innovation, documentation, dissemination, created lasting change. It's a template applicable beyond wartime, beyond aviation. Identify a problem, develop a solution, share the knowledge. Simple in concept, difficult in execution, transformative in effect. For the men who flew with Holloway, who learned his technique, who executed successful belly landings and walked away from wrecked aircraft, the gratitude is personal and profound. They lived lives they otherwise wouldn't have, raised families, pursued careers, experienced joys and sorrows that were nearly erased by hydraulic failure and German flak. In their memoirs and interviews, many credit Holloway not just with saving their lives, but with teaching them something deeper. That desperation isn't the same as hopelessness, that solutions exist if you're willing to think beyond conventional boundaries, that care for your crew demands innovation when routine procedures fail. The crews Holloway never met, who learned his technique secondhand through training manuals and instructor pilots, owe him an equally profound debt. They're the invisible beneficiaries, names that don't appear in Holloway's correspondence or records because the connection is indirect, mediated through institutional knowledge transfer. But the debt exists nonetheless. Every pilot who successfully executed a belly landing using the method, every crew that walked away from a crashed bomber, every family that avoided a War Department telegram, they're all part of Holloway's legacy, whether they knew his name or not. In the end, James Holloway's story is about fundamentals, duty, innovation, and the stubborn insistence that there's always a better way if you're willing to look for it. He approached war not with resignation, but with problem-solving determination. He saw challenges as equations to be balanced, variables to be controlled. And when he found an answer, he shared it freely, without concern for credit or recognition. That generosity, that commitment to collective success over individual glory, defines the best of American military tradition. It's why his story deserves remembrance, why the technique he pioneered remains relevant. Why 70 years after a crippled bomber slid to a stop on an English runway, we still talk about the pilot who refused to eject and invented a way to bring his crew home.